kind of picking one-on-one, because if you're doing comparables directly, Quinn Hughes versus X player, Quinn Hughes versus Y player, of course, in a lot of cases, you look at the intangibles defensively, and most defensemen are better than Hughes. However, if you look at the ensemble, how many Quinn Hughes are there in the NHL?
And for that, you're right,
100%. There's only a handful, and anybody in the league will take him as long as there's someone to protect him. And last year's playoffs, saw us a Montreal team doing exactly that. A guy like Ben Sherratt being protected by Shea Weber, a guy like Joel Edmondson being protected by a guy like Jeff Petrie. But if you were to pick them up individually, you'd be like, well, they don't belong there. But because they're being paired properly and in a proper system, there you go. So you never know what's going to happen.
And that's just it. And I guess maybe it's just because I'm just not a fan of how that defensive in Vancouver is built as a whole. But I mean, it's not horrible. Like, I would assume you have Hughes play with Myers, and then you have Ekman-Larsson play with Poolman. But I mean, I just don't know if Myers is that stability.
There's nothing exciting about the Vancouver defense, and actually the team as a whole for that matter, because Jim Benning is still trying to, mop up the mess that's been left before him. And even though he's put himself in a mess as well with some of the very questionable contracts throughout the years, but you know what? In this case, I think we'll give him a passing grade for these signatures.
100%. And like you said, you have to get these contracts done.
Absolutely.
What they mean to the organization. And Quinn Hughes is a unicorn. So it's good on him for getting them done. It's just that there's significant risk with both of them that we'll see how it works out down the line.
Absolutely. Anthony, once again, thank you so much for your time. You're a very generous man, sir. I really appreciate these segments, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, man, it's going to start costing you something in the near future, but we'll leave that on the back burner until next week.
We'll start with the beer, all right? All right, buddy. Take care.
You too.
And again, a big thank you to our friend and partner, Mr. Anthony DeMarco, for this cool segment of Around the NHL. And I mean, who knows what's going to happen with this Robin Lehner situation? I mean, it's pretty crazy. It's pretty out there, and there's already a lot of allegations that have happened after the recording of that segment. And what can be said about Vancouver? Right, guys? I mean, like we were talking about in this segment about Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes signing those massive contracts. I mean, it is the way of the world right now, right? But right now, we are not going to be talking about high-priced players. We're going to be talking about the neglects, the neglected, the cast-offs, the unwanted, so to speak. And of course, at every training camp, there's always a bunch of players that, hit the waivers for whatever reason. And you're like, oh, I remember him. Or, oh, he's on the waivers. Oh, this is interesting. And looking at the list of the current players on waivers for the past couple of days, it was really interesting. And some notable players, were Kale Flory leading the pack, who, was drafted by Seattle over a certain number 31. Charles Hudon, Noah Joelson, Gabriel Dumont, Brian Flynn, Scott Cowan's personal favorite, Matthew Pekka, Gustav Olofsson, and of course, Keith Kincaid, also part of this list. And what's really funny, Scott, I want to start with you because this is always funny. Every time a former Hab goes on waivers, you always have a bunch of social media posts going, get it back. He was amazing. He was the best. I mean, let's be honest. Nobody here is worth it, right?
The main thing that's just been annoying me about that is, especially with Kale Flory, there's been a huge market of Habs fans on Twitter who have just been posting things saying, reclaim Kale Flory. Like, I want this guy back. This guy was the team. This guy was everything. And I always say to myself, I liked Kale Flory. I thought he was a solid player here. This guy's not a player that is worth reclaiming in any sense by any team in the NHL, not even the Buffalo Sabres, in my own opinion. And while Kale Flory is a talented AHL defenseman. He had 1 goal in 41 games in his first season in Montreal. And while it was a rookie season, I think that just speaks for itself. And I definitely think he'll be a guy who will serve Seattle's AHL team a lot more than if he could serve their NHL team. I think his brother's a much better bet to see a consistent role in Seattle this season. And to throw it back to another player that I have seen some things talked about before is Keith Kincaid. I just want to bring up Keith Kincaid really quick because he had obviously had that very bizarre stint last season where he somehow managed to make the NHL again and play the backup role for the New York Rangers. So who knows? Maybe this season we'll see his typical fantastic tweets that recap the games once more.
Speaking of tweets, I'm going to do a little self-promotion here. When the Buffalo Sabres earlier this afternoon announced that they claimed forward Axel Joelson, oh good lord, Fjallby off of waivers. So excuse me for my pronunciation, Swedish fans. I made a tweet where I was referring to the movie Moneyball, where there's a beautiful scene where general manager Billy Beane is promoting the fact that they want to sign Scott Hatteberg to play first base. This guy goes, who? And I wrote, Kevin Adams says, exactly. He sounds like a Buffalo Sabre already. So it just goes to show that, in some cases you're looking at someone, you're like, who? You're like, all right, yeah, sure, whatever. But Sebastian, I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, do you see any of these guys actually making it back to the NHL, actually making an impact? And of course, the big surprise here is Kale Flory, because it's a little strange that a team will pick someone in the expansion draft without making a side deal, by the way. And next thing you know, well, then he's just exposed to everyone else, and he's so bad that they're confident that no one's going to claim him. I mean, what's up with that?
Yeah, Seattle's draft was interesting. Like I feel like you have like two real viable strategies when you're doing an expansion draft, and it's either you draft to be really good, like Vegas did, or you draft to just get young players and be good down the line and just cash in on high draft picks, especially now with like Shane Wright and Connor Bedard coming up. But it really feels like Seattle just drafted to be mediocre, which is kind of the most painful way to do it. But as far as Kale Flory goes, I think I'm going to disagree with Scott on this. I think that Kale Flory was a really solid player. I always liked him a lot in Laval, and this is a guy that I think is going to be a really solid like number 5, 6 defenseman down the line. Just he's big, he can play, he can make big hits, and he's fun to watch in that way. Like we all remember the big hit on Milan Lucic that he had that won his way into the hearts of all Habs fans, basically. But yeah, I don't think he'd make many NHL teams. I do think he'd make the Buffalo Sabres right now, but so I didn't quite understand why he didn't get claimed in that regard. And a similar thing goes for Noah Joelson, who, again, I don't think that the Habs should have picked him off of waivers, just because I don't think he's a more viable option than Brett Kulak or Chris Weidman or even Sami Niku once he gets healthy again. But if we expand our horizons a little bit to the waiver wires that weren't necessarily former Habs, the one that shocked me that not only being submitted onto waivers, but passing through them was Kale Clegg of the Los Angeles Kings. This is a 23-year-old 6-foot defenseman who had 6 assists in 18 games last season. Just a really solid playmaker, a very strong skater. These are good qualities in a defenseman, and especially if you're a weaker team trying to build up, like the Arizona Coyotes, or I don't know, like the Sabres, or even like the Ottawa Senators. Like any of these like rebuilding teams, I think just taking a flyer on a 23-year-old playmaking defenseman is pretty fun. But again, most of the training camp rosters have established themselves, so I don't think many teams really wanted to add a player, and Montreal only added Montembeault because Price is injured, right? Like if Price were healthy, they never would have claimed him. I
guess you could also add, we're talking about this off air, we could also add Phoenix Copley as well from Washington as a surprise waiver.
I mean, he's 29 and he hasn't played that many games in the NHL, though he had like a a season with over a 900 save percentage, right? So like he's had flashes, but the Capitals clearly weren't that confident in him when they lost Vitek Vanacek to Seattle and then traded to get him back. So, I mean, sure. I mean, he was going to get waived at some point, and I'm sure he's been waived quite often in the past, considering he's played many games in the AHL. But yeah, I mean, there are always decent players that pass through waivers.
You would expect more from the man hailing from the North Pole. Scott, you wanted to go back a little bit about the ex-Habs because we wanted to go to Josh, but now he's choking on his water in the corner there, probably because of that massive ice cream he was eating earlier. You wanted to bring up a couple of players as well, Charles Hudon being one of them.
Yeah, there's three guys who, in particular, from former Habs, who stood out to me, just because I've talked about this before with guys like Joseph Blandisi and Jean-Sébastien D. We're just going to leave that there. But I mean, these are kind of the kind of players that basically, no matter how long they're gone from the NHL, they always find their way back to the NHL in some way or another. And the three guys that I'm talking about are Charles Hudon, Gabriel Dumas, and Brian Flynn. Now, Canadians fans of a certain age or from a certain time or following the team for different seasons will remember all these players for different reasons. Gabriel Dumas was a prospect the Habs had for a couple of seasons who then went on to do other things once he never was able to quite figure out his game here in Montreal. Brian Flynn played on the Habs fourth line for 2 seasons and was a really solid speed option. And Charles Hudon was the player who for one season Habs fans thought would be the next big scoring star for the team. And then by the next season wanted nothing to do with him. Now, all three of these guys have been on their own completely separate paths, but they still find themselves back at the same place on the waiver wire. Gabriel Dumas and Charles Hudon are both on waivers with Tampa, and Brian Flynn is on waivers with the New Jersey Devils. Now, while I think all of these guys will continue to be really, really solid AHL players this season, with Hudon, I think, having the chance to actually win the AHL scoring title, I know it's a bit of a bold claim myself, I can just as easily see them coming back to the NHL because they have the NHL skills, and they've proven it before and being able to play full NHL or even part-time NHL seasons. So.
Mr. Rosa. You okay, man?
I'm alive.
You're alive. You're good.
I didn't choke on my water fully.
How about you chime in, my friend? How about like you've seen the list of waiver wires? I like to know your opinion about these former Habs and actually many former Habs on this list. And what was your impression when you saw this particular list that was presented to us actually just a few minutes ago?
Yeah, I was, for one, surprised about Brian Flynn. I forgot that he was still in the league. Not to say anything about him. He's just, I remember his time fondly in Montreal and he just kind of disappeared after that. He had his time here and that's it. And the names on here aren't particularly surprising to me. I just get sad every time I think about Noah Joelson, about how well he was projecting, how he was on track to becoming an NHL player that year that he took 2 pucks to the head in the same game, and that pretty much derailed his career.
Bad luck ever, man.
It's awful. Yeah. And you could always hope that he has the skills that are still there to become an NHL player. You just hope that he can do it physically. He was losing vision in one eye at one point, I remember. But he's come back. He's playing, which is a great sign. And it's just so sad thinking about it. I hope, for as much as I can hope, that he can make it in the NHL somewhere.
Hopefully, you never know. But I mean, also, the one guy I always gets sad when I see him on waivers or not being able to crack the NHL, which in a way might be a little bit of his own fault at this point because it's not for a lack of skill, is Charles Hudon. I've always had a soft spot for the kid. He has such great hands, has good speed. But even after seeing a couple of AHL games live and everything, you just saw that, you know what, this is a kid who he's a little bit selfish, I guess, on the ice. Just wants to be the star of the game, but obviously that doesn't always translate well into the NHL. So,
well, what it does translate well into is overseas. In my opinion, I think that's exactly where Hudon should have stayed. Just made good money over in Switzerland. But
yeah, I don't know if it's just a money thing or it's just a family thing. Who knows? But yeah, like overseas, I'm pretty sure he would have been absolutely incredible. But it is what it is. And on that note, we're going to end this segment with a little bit of fun. I mean, the Doug Armstrong, general manager of the St. Louis Blues and as well of Team Canada, for the upcoming